Hello folks, my name is Drew Leonard, and if you're watching this, you've either followed my website, followed my blog, or followed the YouTube channel, or whatever the case may be, for a little while now. We've been working strenuously on a couple of new projects, and one of those is this new book, New Heavens and New Earth, and we're really excited for its release. There's been a lot of attention about it already. Several of you have written to me in the past, You've asked if I've written anything on that, and I started work on this manuscript really back in about 2018. And so today we've got the book coming out later this month. We'll just talk a little bit about that, answer some of your questions, answer maybe some interests that you've had about the book. And I've got with me today my wife Hannah, and we're just going to kind of share a conversation and answer some questions, and hopefully you'll find it a little bit invigorating.
Okay, so the new book, like you said, it comes out later this month, November 29th to be exact. My husband Drew has 7 other books available. His website is cadleonard.com, and you can subscribe there to the newsletter, and then you can also subscribe here to the YouTube channel. Drew, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. The first one is, why did you feel the need to write A New Heavens and a New Earth?
Yeah, so I had a particular individual in mind. Back in 2018, I think it was, who contacted me and he said, have you written anything on this? Well, at the time, I was studying really intensely the book of Isaiah. And I remember sitting in my office one day, and I had a scrap piece of paper there. And I was just jotting notes down about Isaiah, but particularly looking at his text in Isaiah 65, Isaiah 66. And I was trying to work through the New Heavens and New Earth material of his own text. And I had spent some time in that particular unit of text a while back before then, even before 2018. But I started jotting down some information, just some thoughts, kind of outlining some material. And what happened was I had 6 chapters, basically, that's like, I think I could develop these into 6 chapters, 6 major points. But I kept getting asked by different people, have you done any work on New Heavens and New Earth? Have you looked at this renovated Earth view? And I heard a couple of other people lecture on it, some of them really good, some of them really poor. And people started asking me, I think they had known that I had done a little bit of reading and writing on the prophets. And so when they started asking me my own take, I felt the need maybe to at least put my thoughts together into a manuscript. And like I said, you and I, we've known that this has been in works now for 2 years, 3 years, and we finished the manuscript in 2020, September 2020, and just now, this is a whole year later now, a little bit over a year later, we're finally deciding to release it for reasons that we hope are to the glory of God. Now, something that we should probably tell our viewers is that you've read the book. You've read the whole book, cover to cover. And so I've got some questions for you just from a reader's perspective. You've asked me some questions, and will continue to in the rest of this video, about a writer's perspective on it. But let me ask you a couple of questions then from a reader's perspective. The first one being, what are some of the things that you felt like as a reader that you learned or gained from the book? What are some of the things that just come to mind?
Well, I mean, I have the advantage of living with you every day, so I've heard this stuff
or disadvantage.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it. I've had the advantage of, hearing this stuff now for a couple of years. So when I read it, I wouldn't say that I really, learned anything that I didn't know, because I was obviously involved with you writing the whole book, but I feel like it's always good to go back and re-examine text, even if you've studied them a million times. And I just think that, your argumentation, for me anyway, was very convincing, even on text, even that I know what you believe on.
Yeah.
So it's good for me to go back and just, see it in a written form, see all of the arguments laid out. And I think, too, getting a new perspective and, hearing all of the different viewpoints, it's good to help put together your personal view.
Yeah.
So I think, I didn't really learn anything new, but I think a definite reader out there would, learn something new.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I think you're the next question, right?
Yep.
You're asking me. Okay.
Okay, so what was your writing process like for this book? And was it the same for this book as it has been for like all of your other books? Or did you feel the need to approach this book differently?
Some of the material, like some of my approach was the same, but some of it is radically different. And what I mean is I always try to do a better job about outlining. When I was first starting out writing material, whether it was articles even, or some of my smaller, earlier books, I did a really poor job at outlining the material. And so now everything I put out, I try to arrange with extreme precision. I felt like some of those earlier works were just really badly arranged. So now everything is still trying to be arranged so that it makes really good sense to a reader or a listener, even for that matter. But there's a really big difference between writing a commentary, something that I'm really passionate about. I'm working on a Genesis commentary right now. I hope to start an Isaiah commentary in 2023. So the commentary is just you sitting there with the text and all of these other tools as you're trying to develop that particular text. But this is a different kind of beast, and that is because it's a critique. So not only am I having to work with the text, I'm also having to work with a body of material or data that's being given to me by those that would hold the view called renovated earth. And I'm having not only to assess the biblical text, I'm also having to assess the data that's been given to us through whether it be preachers or scholars or writers or whomever it may be. We've got to assess two different bodies of data. And then we're trying to bring all of that together into one book. And so it's a little bit more overwhelming because you're having to assess almost twice as much data. Not only the text, but also what's been said in the field on this kind of material. So the writing style is a little bit different as well. Like not just my approach, but also the writing style. I'm aware that critique is really frowned upon today. It's almost like we want to be just a subjectivist world where everything's okay. And you take on the task of like critiquing somebody, you immediately run the risk of hurting feelings, making people feel small. And that's not the goal of this book. But as much as I hate to say it, in some cases it may leave that kind of taste in somebody's mouth. But we've tried to write in a style where we are critiquing the view. It is just a critical analysis of whether or not renovated earth stands or falls as a thesis. But at the end of the day, we're not trying to belittle people. We try to write with even a conversational tone. While we may be sharp at times, we're trying to let them know that we love these people as brethren. So it's a little different. So then the next question I've got for you as a reader is, how is the readability? Kind of the same kind of vein of thought. How is the readability of the book? How is the writing style? How does it come off to you as a reader? And would you consider the book complex? I know that's like 3 questions, but they kind of all go together.
So yeah, like you said, whenever you get into critiquing somebody, it's always tricky ground, and I think that's part of the reason why we waited so long to release the book.
Right, yeah.
We've tried to be patient and prayerful about it, but I think the readability, like you said, it's more of a conversational tone, and that's because you are doing a critique of another view.
Yeah.
You're not strictly just going through a text, even though you deal with several texts in the book. You're not just going straight through a text of one specific book. So the first couple of chapters are definitely more conversational. But even the chapters that you're dealing with text, I would say they're more conversational than like your commentaries are.
Okay.
So I feel like the readability is, I think it's good. I think that because it's more conversational, any person can read it. Not to say that it's not complex, which is another one of your questions. I think that the book is very complex, but I think that if somebody takes the book and they're patient with it and they really put the effort into it, I think that they can at least get something out of it. The writing style, like you said, it's very conversational. I think that it's not just like a wispy kind of conversational, though. There's still a lot of content there. You're dealing with a lot of material in the book, and you say several times even you can't deal with all of the content
Yeah.
that's centered around this topic. But yeah, it's very conversational. I think that it is complex, but I think if you're patient and you sit down and you really try to understand, I think anybody can get at least something from the book.
So would you say you've said it is complex, and I think it is as well. And I've read a lot of the big hitters in the biblical field. I would think that this book is right up there with some of the most weighty material that I've read in my life. Is there any advice then that you would have for a reader who maybe hasn't read so much weighty material, and this might be a little bit of a shock to them? Is there any advice that you would have for that kind of reader who maybe it is too complex even for? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I would say the first step is always to like familiarize yourself with the topic in general. So if you don't know anything about the topic of a new heavens and a new earth, you should probably start there.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
I mean, just familiarizing yourself with that, familiarizing yourself with the other views, which you do a good job in your book of doing. I think that you represent several different views, even like in the brotherhood, outside of the brotherhood. I think one of the big names you bring up is N.T. Wright. And his view. So I think that you do a good job of like presenting all the views, but I still think that if you don't really know much about the topic, you're going to be a little confused even reading the book. So okay. I would think just start familiarizing yourself with the view, the texts that revolve around the view.
Yeah.
Maybe even just start with some commentaries. I think that would be a good first step.
Yeah, I would think that just starting with the text, if you don't know the texts that we're working around, that would be a really good place to at least start. Yeah.
Okay. My third question for you is: what makes your book stand out or exceptional among other literature on this topic?
Good question. This is one of the things that, Paul said he didn't boast in anything except for the cross. So I'm going to use the word pride. And you know that I'm not trying to be arrogant. Maybe I am, but I'm not trying to be. One of the things I really think I would pride myself on this book is that it's not just me writing about the texts. My view would be that this book is educating us on how to read the texts. And I think that's a radical difference. You can tell me how to change the oil in my car, but there's a difference between telling me how and teaching me how. And this book is unique in my perspective in that it not only tells you how to read the texts, but it teaches you how to read the texts. And I have another book. It's called Essays in Intertextuality, which does the same kind of thing, but it's on a broader scale with all different other prophetic texts. And I had one unnamed proofreader, who I will not name, say that New Heavens and New Earth, he has read it and he has read Essays in Intertextuality. He said, I love New Heavens and New Earth. He said, it is as if you are redoing Essays in Intertextuality, but specifically on the topic of New Heavens and New Earth. That book is an educational tool to teach us how to read the Old Testament prophets. So all I've done basically is take the strategies laid out in Essays in Intertextuality, which I am completely committed to, and I have now dropped those into a new framework specifically on the issue of New Heavens and New Earth. How are we to read Isaiah? How does the New Testament grab hold of Isaiah? And that's a phenomenon that I think most of the big hitters have done extraordinarily poorly on. I know that sounds arrogant, I know that sounds sharp, but I just think that some of these big names, I'm talking scholarly names, I'm talking names that are in the field, that are out front, Walter Brueggemann, J.J.M. Roberts, Brevard Childs, John Willis. I don't think these guys get the phenomenon to its fullness. I think that if I were to throw a name out of somebody who gets what's going on in these kinds of texts and who has influenced me the most, it's Jim McGuigan. Jim McGuigan's books on the Old Testament prophets, and then anything where he writes on the New Testament and how it uses the Old Testament, he was advanced beyond C.H. Dodd, beyond Richard Hayes, and beyond a host of others in the field before they ever even came around. Dodd was a little bit before McGuigan, actually, but some of these big guys, G.K. Beale, Richard Hayes, these guys are now saying in 2021 what McGuigan was saying back in the late 70s. And it just seems like if you read his material, he's got a great take on it. And I think the book then takes McGuigan's view and it teaches us then, using that kind of view, how to read specifically this one instance of how does the New Testament use Isaiah's text on the New Heavens, New Earth. And it leaves us feeling comfortable just to read the text at the end. I think that's what the book has to offer. It teaches you how to read these texts appropriately. So I think the next question then for you would be, how necessary do you think it is to read the book versus study this book? And maybe some of our viewers don't even understand what I mean by a difference of reading versus studying, and you might even say something about that. Should readers take the time to read the scriptures and spend their own personal time in contexts that are raised if they're not fully aware of those contexts already? What do you think?
So we hit on this a little bit in the last
Right.
question even, but so what I think you mean by read versus study is, should you just take the book and read through it cover to cover? And I think what you mean by study is, should you break it down, use some commentaries with it, study the text in between? And personally, I think that you should study the book instead of read it. I think that you could get something out of it just by reading it cover to cover. But I think especially if you're not familiar with these texts, then you definitely need to sit down with a commentary. And I would say even maybe read the book, study it as you go, and then after you've read through the book, study those texts even more on your own, and maybe even go back and read parts of your book again. Because I think it's good to establish your view based on other research. I think I try to do that with you even. I'm a little biased, but
Yeah.
I think I try to study it on my own and formulate my own view, and we don't agree on everything. And I don't think you expect everybody to agree with you.
No, we'll talk about that.
So I think that definitely they need to sit down and study and go through the text. These are some complex texts that you're dealing with. And I think just to sit down and read through the book, you're not going to get the full emphasis of what you're saying about the text, especially with the context. You need to go through and read all that. And Daniel, you don't deal with specifically as a text related to this, but I think that you deal with it enough in your Revelation section. I would even go back and study Daniel. I think it's important to study all of these texts before you sit down and start reading cover to cover in this book.
Yeah, so one of our proofreaders, who I will not name also, has spent enough time with me to know where I'm going at a lot of this. Now, this particular proofreader was somewhat hostile or caustic to it at the first, read it a second time, and then started to see, a lot of this starts to make sense. It might be best maybe even for somebody who's not so familiar with the waters in which they're starting to tread, it might be best for them either to just read the book through first, just to see what's going on here, and then go back and study it, or vice versa, study it, and then go back and give it a second read. Because some of this is just going to be, they're going to need to get familiar with the content. And especially then I'm going to offer some new angles on some things that it might be a little bit shocking at first. Just spend some time with it. Immerse yourself in the world of the discussion, and it might start to clear up.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, good advice.
Okay, so question number 4. Do you consider your book to endorse or reject the renovated earth view?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's one that a lot of people are going to be interested in. I think right now we've had a lot of interest in the book. And I think a lot of people are also kind of unsure. And they're wondering, is Drew Leonard for or against renovated earth? And I emphatically say that I'm against it. I am against the view. And the book is going to explain why. Now, the reason that I think I also need to let people know that you don't want to just start recommending my book wholesale is because I'm going to give a different analysis of the material. And I'm one of those who feels very compelled. I only recommend a book after I know the content of the book. If I don't know the book, I may say, well, I've heard this is good, but I have not read it. So don't take that as a recommendation from Drew Leonard. Take it as it could be good. And with this book, I'm going to argue basically that the renovated earth position just simply hasn't been established. I'm going to make the argument all throughout the book. They've just simply not established their thesis. I'm not openly saying that they're completely wrong about all of this. I'm just simply saying that there's a lot of stuff that they at least need to work out. And this is something that I think that people do need to hear, If you're not able to read the whole book, I don't remember how long it is, maybe 230, 250 pages.
I think 264 maybe.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's right. The final is 264 with all the blank pages and the references and everything. And I was going somewhere with all of that. If you're not able to read the whole 264-page book, I think people will at least want to know that in chapter 10, the concluding remarks, I give a bullet point list of 50 different things that I'm persuaded the renovated earth view as a whole needs to work through. Now, what it is basically, it's a 50-point list of a summary of my book. To say, this is all of the stuff I've brought before you in this book, they need to handle this. But if there are 50 different things, it ought to at least make us question, is renovated earth to be taken seriously? And if it is, how are they going to handle these 50 things? This is not, let me tell you and the viewers, what this is not. This 50-point list is not shallow. It is heavy. It is something that if you hold renovated earth as a thesis, you've got your homework now cut out for you. And so what I'm saying is that this book rejects renovated earth, but that's a different question altogether, something I do seek to bring up in the book as well, as to whether or not it's a fellowship matter. Whether or not somebody's established a thesis, and whether or not somebody's now to be cast out of fellowship with Christ are two different questions. I don't think renovated earth stands. I just haven't seen the evidence for it. And the book's going to bring that out, but the book's also going to deal with the question of whether or not it's a fellowship issue. And hopefully I'll handle that in a way that would honor God. So, your question, the next question. We've got just a couple more here. Let's see. Number 4. Do you as a reader feel that the book is demanding that you, if you were completely neutral coming into this whole read, do you feel that I'm demanding that you share or take the same view as me, the author?
Okay, so we talked earlier about critiquing a view. You're already on shaky ground.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you made it clear that you disagree with the renovated earth view. However, I don't feel that you push, forcefully that you need to take the same view as yourself. I think you say throughout the book several times, you don't have to agree with me on this, although you do think it's a good point.
Yeah.
Though I don't think that you're being pushy saying you need to take the same view as me, I think that you are forceful with your arguments, and I think any good debater or arguer would do that, be forceful,
right.
Presenting the evidence for their views. And obviously, if you didn't believe it, you wouldn't write on it. So I think that it's a balance between being sure of your view and also not being forceful, so that people are like, you must believe the same thing I believe.
Right. Yeah, good.
Okay, my next question for you is, do you think that this book needs to be pushed to all members of the church? Should everybody get a copy of this book, so even your average pew sitter, and just start reading it?
No, and this is probably the primary reason that the book hasn't been released until now. It's just not an issue for me. I would have loved to have stayed out of this discussion, but it keeps coming up. And I keep seeing people just fighting, a lot of people fighting on Facebook over something like this. And I think that there's been more harm because of renovated earth as a view done than anything good. And that's frustrating on both sides. I think that there are people on the side that hold renovated earth that have pushed this harder than they've ever gospeled about anything to anybody. And I think that's a severe problem. But on the other side, I think that there are people who are more eager to reject renovated earth than they've ever been interested in gospeling to anybody. And I think that's a problem. When your priorities aren't to make sure that the cross is going forth first and primarily, I think you've got your priorities messed up. And I'm seeing a little bit of this as a problem on both sides. So one of the reasons I didn't want to put a book out on it is I didn't want to make the conversation worse. And I hope that we don't. I hope that the book is used as a good tool to maybe blend the two sides and at least try to bring about some kind of reasoning and rationality about all of this. But people are going to be people, and some people are going to want to say that everything's a fellowship issue, and there are going to be other radicals who say that nothing's a fellowship issue. And I think that there are two extremes we're dealing with here. I'm trying to be a voice somewhere in the middle, and I'm trying to establish that upon good scriptural grounds. the book either does or doesn't do that. And if it doesn't do that, well, we need to get right. But I would not recommend this book to the average sitter in the pew. In fact, it's written for the purpose of trying to stop it from being one that reaches everybody in the pew. I think that ideally every Christian should have a take on every text, but it's not an ideal world. And that means that we're going to have elderly members sitting in the pews who need to know nothing about renovated earth. They don't need to hear this as a discussion. They need to hear something about, oh, they've been struggling with cancer, or they lost a child, or their spouse is causing problems in their relationship. These are the kinds of things that there are some Christians who will never get to the point where they can handle a discussion on renovated earth, and that is not a bad thing at all. It is our job to be responsible and not be pushing this as the gospel, as if these people need to know that. So I would not recommend this book. I know it's my own book, but I wouldn't recommend it to everybody. It's not for everybody. It's written specifically to a view that I think is not the core of the gospel. I think it is a skirted issue. It's an outskirt of what is the core of the gospel, and I think we need to keep our focus there. This is written hopefully trying to bring us back to the middle and seeing what the gospel is and why it's a priority. So I think that's the best way to go with it. Last question for you. This is your last word that you can give to the readers. What's a final word that you might give as a piece of advice to readers of this book?
Well, my first piece of advice would be start with an open mind. Whether you're on the renovated earth side of things, whether you're against the renovated earth side of things, you need to sit down with an open mind and honestly examine the text. I think that they need to study. I mean, these texts, like we've said several times, you're not going to get everything you could out of the book unless you study these texts. I also would say, don't get overwhelmed. There is a lot of content in this book. And if you're reading through and you're not understanding, what you're reading,
join the crowd.
yeah. Take your time and read through it again until you can make sense out of it. I mean, obviously it's a book. You're not on some kind of time crunch where you have to have it read in 5 days or something like that. Yeah. Just take your time. Go through the text as you're reading. Be open-minded, and I think that you'll benefit from the book in some way or another. I mean, even good. If they come out disagreeing with you, I think that just examining different views is always an advantage.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
Okay, so my last question for you now. If I were a random reader, and I'd never read this book before, I wasn't your wife, interested in this subject matter, what would you say to persuade me on the necessity of purchasing your book?
So you are interested in the subject matter?
Yes.
Well, I think this would go back to that earlier question as to what makes this book stand out. And my biggest point that I would make to anybody who's on the fence about buying this book, who is interested in the subject, I would simply say, this book's going to educate you on how to read the prophets. You're not going to feel unsure about Isaiah anymore. Or you're certainly not going to feel unsure about how Peter or John use Isaiah. And I think that is a problem with this particular thesis. I think that a lot of these guys think they know. They would say, oh, I know what's going on in these texts. I think they would say, I know what's going on in Matthew 5:5. I know what's going on in John 14:1-6. I know what's going on in Acts 3:21. I know what's going on in Romans 8:18-25. I know what's going on in 2 Peter 3. And I know what's going on in Revelation 21. I think the majority of both the renovated earth guys and those that reject the thesis would say that they know what's going on in these texts. But I think, this is pure speculation, I think that a lot of them would also admit their ignorance when it comes to Isaiah. Not all of them. I think some of them would say, oh, I feel as equally comfortable in Isaiah as well. But I'm convinced that they're not. And I'm convinced that this book is going to take us back to Isaiah, back to Ezekiel, back to the prophets, and say, let's read the Old Testament for its own voice first. And then we'll have prepared ourselves to read the New Testament, how it makes use of the Old. And I'm convinced that until we do that, we are not yet on good footing to read Peter or John or any of the others on the topic of renovated earth. Whether or not it goes is not a point I'm interested at this point in talking about. I'm just simply saying my book is going to educate you on how to read the prophets. I am mainly influenced on this particular matter by Jim McGuigan, and I think that anybody who doesn't have his commentaries would be very richly blessed in getting those as supplemental material as well. I think they'll make for a rich reading of the prophets, and so by the time you're fully read through on Isaiah, when you get to Peter or John, you're going to at the least, see where my book is coming from. You may not agree with it, but you're at least going to have to say, this man's working with a thesis that is at the least, plausible. So, hopefully that's what would persuade an individual to, if they are interested in the subject, get this book, because at the end of it, you'll at least feel comfortable on how to read the prophets and the New Testament use of them. Well, folks, that's what we've got for you. Those are our questions. And like we said, A New Heavens and a New Earth comes out November 29th. It is 264 pages. I think that's the number. I think that's right. And it's very thorough. It teaches you how to read the Old Testament. And hopefully it'll find some place on your bookshelves, and more particularly in your hands as you spend some time with it. And maybe you can educate yourself a little bit more on the topics of a new heavens and a new earth and renovated earth. Or maybe better yet, you could even educate me and point out some things if you feel like you disagree. We're always happy to accept disagreement, and especially the compliments. We prefer compliments rather than disagreement. But if you have any questions or concerns or anything, reach out to us through email. We'd love to hear from you. And when you let us know that we're doing a good job and we're serving Christ, it makes us want to try to do better. So we want to thank you for being with us, watching this video. And may God richly bless you always, to His glory.